Chosen one, there's a certain kind of moment that doesn't look important on the outside. No big announcement. No sudden shift that everyone else can see. Just a quiet realization that something in you isn't the same anymore. Maybe it happened while you were sitting alone, doing nothing special. Maybe it came after a long period of confusion, when things didn't make sense and nothing seemed to move forward the way you expected. Or maybe it didn't feel like a moment at all, more like a slow awareness that crept in over time, until one day you couldn't ignore it anymore. You started noticing your reactions changing. The things that used to excite you don't hit the same. The conversations you once entertained now feel surface level. Even the way you look at your own life, it's different. Not better in a flashy way, just deeper. And if you've been feeling that shift, not fully understanding it but knowing it's real, then what you're experiencing isn't random confusion. It's what happens when someone reaches a point where they're finally ready to see themselves without distraction. Not perfect, not finished, just aware. And that awareness changes everything. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with growth that people don't talk about enough. Not the kind where you have no one around you, but the kind where you feel like you don't fully connect the way you used to. You can be in a room full of people and still feel like your mind is somewhere else. Conversations feel repetitive. Reactions feel predictable. And you start to notice patterns in people that you never paid attention to before. It's not that you think you're better than anyone. It's that you're seeing things from a place you haven't stood in before. That can feel isolating. Because when your perspective changes, your environment doesn't automatically change with it. You're still in the same spaces, around the same people, but internally, you've moved. And that gap between who you were and who you're becoming can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort like that isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that something is shifting in a way that can't be reversed. Chosen one of the first real signs of this kind of shift is how you start responding to situations that used to trigger you. There was a time when certain words, certain actions, certain types of people would immediately pull a reaction out of you. You didn't have to think about it. It was automatic. But now there's a pause. Not because you're holding yourself back forcefully, but because you're actually seeing the situation differently. You're recognizing what's worth your energy and what is. And that pause might seem small, but it's one of the biggest indicators of internal growth. Because when you gain control over your reactions, you gain control over your direction. You're no longer being pulled by every external force. You're choosing where your attention goes. And that changes the outcome of your life more than any external opportunity ever could. Another thing that starts to happen is you become more aware of your own patterns. Not in a judgmental way, not in a way where you're constantly criticizing yourself, but in a clear, honest way where you can actually see the habits, thoughts, and behaviors that have been shaping your life. You might start noticing how often you overthink, or how you tend to pull back when something starts to feel uncertain, or how you sometimes look for validation without even realizing it. And instead of ignoring those patterns, you sit with them. You question them. You try to understand where they come from. That level of self-awareness can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the ability to blame everything outside of you. But at the same time, it gives you something much more valuable. It gives you the ability to change. Because once you can see something clearly, you're no longer controlled by it in the same way. Chosen one, there's also a shift in how you handle time. You stop chasing everything at once. You stop feeling like you need to prove something immediately. There's less urgency, but more intention. You start valuing your time differently. Not in a rigid or extreme way, but in a way where you naturally move away from things that drain you and move toward things that actually matter. And what's interesting is, from the outside, it might look like you've slowed down. But internally, you're becoming more focused than ever. because you're no longer scattering your energy in 10 different directions. You're placing it carefully, even if that means doing less. And that kind of focus builds something real over time. There's also a noticeable change in how you deal with uncertainty. Before, not knowing what's going to happen next might have caused anxiety or stress. You might have felt the need to figure everything out immediately, to have a clear plan, to feel in control. But now, there's more acceptance of the unknown. Not because you have all the answers, but because you've started to trust your ability to handle whatever comes. And that trust doesn't come from positive thinking or forcing confidence. It comes from experience, from going through situations you thought you couldn't handle and realizing that you did, from making mistakes and learning from them instead of letting them define you, from seeing yourself adapt even when things didn't go as planned. That kind of trust is quiet, but it's powerful because it removes the fear that used to hold you back. Chosen one, as this shift continues, you may also notice changes in your relationships. Some connections feel stronger, more real, more aligned with who you're becoming. Others start to feel distant, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the way you connect has changed. You're less interested in surface-level interactions. You're more aware of energy, of intention, of consistency. And when those things aren't there, it becomes harder to stay engaged the way you used to. That doesn't mean you need to cut people off or make sudden decisions. It just means you're becoming more selective with your presence. And that selectiveness is not about exclusion, it's about alignment. Because as you grow, your environment either supports that growth or slows it down. And you start to recognize the difference. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath all of this. It's not just about habits or reactions or relationships. It's about identity. You're no longer defining yourself the same way you used to. The labels, the expectations, the roles you once held onto, they don't feel as solid anymore. And that can feel confusing. Because when old identities start to fall away, there's a period where you don't fully know who you are yet. But that space is necessary. It's where real change happens. Because instead of inheriting an identity from your past, you're actively shaping one based on awareness, based on choice, based on who you are now, not who you were expected to be. Chosen one, this process doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single breakthrough moment that fixes everything. It's a series of realizations, small shifts, quiet decisions that gradually change the way you move through life. And some days will still feel unclear. Some days you'll question whether you're actually moving forward. That's normal. Growth doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it just feels like uncertainty with awareness. But if you look closely, you'll see the difference. In how you think, in how you respond, in what you tolerate, in what you value. And those differences, even when they seem small, are what create long-term change. So if you've been feeling this shift, if you've been noticing these changes without fully understanding them, take a moment to recognize what's actually happening. You're not lost. You're not falling behind. You're not missing something that everyone else has figured out. You're becoming more aware of yourself in a way that most people avoid. And that awareness, while uncomfortable at times, is what allows real growth to happen. If any part of this connected with your experience, feel free to share your thoughts. Not because you have to, but because sometimes putting these things into words helps you understand them even more clearly. Chosen one, there's a phase in this journey that feels almost invisible, even to you. Nothing dramatic is happening on the outside. No major wins, no clear milestones. If anything, it might even feel like things have slowed down or become uncertain. But internally, something is reorganizing itself in a way that doesn't need external validation to exist. This is the part most people misunderstand. Because we're used to measuring progress through visible results, achievements, recognition, movement. But there's another kind of progress that happens beneath the surface, where your thinking becomes sharper, your awareness becomes deeper, and your decisions start coming from a place that feels more stable. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it's real. Chosen one, you may have noticed that your tolerance for distraction has started to change. Things that once filled your time without question now feel unnecessary. Endless scrolling, meaningless conversations, habits that didn't require much thought, they start to feel heavier than they used to. Not because they're inherently bad, but because you're becoming more conscious of where your attention goes. And attention is one of the most valuable things you have. Once you realize that, it becomes harder to give it away without intention. So you begin to pull back, not in an extreme way, not cutting everything off at once, but gradually. You start choosing what deserves your focus instead of letting everything compete for it. And that shift alone can completely change the direction of your life over time. Because where your attention goes, your energy follows. And where your energy goes, results eventually appear. There's also a growing awareness of how much of your past behavior was automatic. Not wrong, not something to regret, just unconscious. You might start recognizing moments where you reacted out of habit rather than intention. Times when you said yes when you meant no. Times when you held back instead of expressing yourself honestly. And instead of feeling frustrated about it, you start observing it. That observation is important because it creates space between you and your patterns. And in that space, you gain the ability to choose differently. Chosen one, another subtle but powerful shift is how you start to handle silence. There was a time when being alone with your thoughts might have felt uncomfortable. You needed noise, distraction, something to fill the space. But now, silence doesn't feel empty in the same way. It feels revealing. Because in silence, you can actually hear yourself think. You can notice what's been sitting in the background. You can process things without interruption. And while that can be intense at times, it's also where clarity comes from. Because without constant input, your mind has the chance to organize itself, to sort through what matters and what doesn't, to separate external noise from internal truth. Chosen one, you may also be noticing a shift in how you define success. It's no longer just about reaching a certain point or achieving a specific outcome. It's becoming more about how you feel while moving toward it. The quality of your thinking, the way you handle challenges, the level of control you have over your own mindset. External success still matters, but it's no longer the only measure. Because you've started to understand something important. If your internal state is unstable, external success won't feel the way you expect it to. So instead of chasing outcomes blindly, you're building something more solid underneath. A mindset that can actually hold the results you're working toward. Chosen one, there's also a noticeable change in how you deal with other people's opinions. Before, certain opinions might have had a stronger impact on you. Approval felt important, criticism felt heavier. But now, there's a bit more distance. Not in a cold or dismissive way, but in a grounded way where you can listen without immediately absorbing everything. You start asking yourself, does this actually align with what I know about myself? And if it doesn't, you let it pass. That doesn't mean you ignore feedback or refuse to learn. It just means you're no longer defined by every external perspective. And that independence creates a level of stability that can't be easily shaken. Chosen one, something else begins to shift quietly, your relationship with effort. You stop looking for shortcuts that bypass growth. You stop expecting everything to come easily. Not because you want things to be hard, but because you've started to see the value in the process itself. You understand that the person you become, while working towards something, is just as important as the result. So instead of avoiding effort, you start leaning into it. You become more patient, more consistent, more willing to stay with something even when it's not immediately rewarding. And that consistency builds something that quick wins never could. Chosen one, there's also a deeper emotional shift happening. You become more aware of your own emotional patterns. Not just what you feel, but why you feel it. You start recognizing triggers. You start noticing how certain situations bring out certain reactions. And instead of being completely controlled by those reactions, you begin to understand them. That understanding creates a different kind of control. Not suppression, not pretending emotions aren't there, but the ability to experience them without being overwhelmed by them. To respond instead of react. To process instead of avoid. And that emotional awareness becomes one of your strongest assets, because it allows you to move through situations with clarity instead of confusion. Chosen one, as all of this continues, you might find yourself becoming more selective with your energy. Not in a rigid or isolated way, but in a way that reflects your growth. You don't feel the need to be everywhere, to engage in everything, to respond to every situation. You start choosing where you show up, and more importantly, where you don't, because you've realized that not everything deserves your attention. And that realization protects your focus in a way that nothing else can. Chosen one, there's a point where all these small shifts start to connect. Your awareness, your reactions, your focus, your emotional understanding, they begin to align. And when that alignment happens, your life starts to feel different. Not perfect, not effortless, but intentional. You're no longer moving randomly. You're moving with awareness. And that awareness creates direction. Even when you don't have everything figured out, you know you're not the same person you were before. And that difference matters, because real change isn't about becoming someone completely new overnight. It's about gradually becoming more aligned with who you already are beneath the noise. Chosen one, if you've been feeling this shift, if you've been noticing these changes in yourself without fully being able to explain them, take a moment to recognize what that means. It means you're paying attention. It means you're no longer operating on autopilot. It means you're actively participating in your own growth instead of just reacting to whatever happens around you. And that level of awareness is rare. Not because it's difficult to reach, but because it requires honesty. It requires you to look at yourself clearly, without avoiding what's uncomfortable. And most people never fully do that. But you are. And that changes everything over time. If this resonates with where you are right now, you can share your perspective. Sometimes hearing how others experience these shifts adds a level of clarity that you wouldn't reach on your own. Chosen one, there comes a stage in this process where things stop feeling like a phase and start feeling like a new baseline. At first, these changes felt temporary, like something you were going through, something you were trying to understand. But now it's becoming clear that this isn't something you're passing through. This is who you're becoming. And that realization can feel both grounding and unfamiliar at the same time. Because when your baseline changes, your expectations change with it. You don't approach life the same way anymore. You don't respond the same way. You don't even think the same way. And while part of you might still look back at who you used to be, there's another part of you that knows you can't fully return to that version. Not because it was wrong, but because you've seen too much now. You've understood too much. And awareness, once gained, doesn't just disappear. Chosen one, there's also a deeper level of responsibility that comes with this awareness. Not responsibility in a heavy or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, personal way. You start to realize that your choices, matter more than you once thought. The way you spend your time, the way you respond to challenges, the way you treat people, the way you treat yourself. All of it adds up. And instead of feeling like life is just happening to you, there's a growing sense that you're actively shaping it. That can feel empowering, but it can also feel like pressure if you're not used to it. Because now, it's harder to ignore the impact of your decisions. It's harder to pretend things don't matter. But that awareness is what gives you control. Because when you recognize your influence over your own life, you're no longer waiting for things to change on their own. You become part of the process. Chosen one, there's a moment where you start to notice how differently you handle setbacks. Before, setbacks might have felt like proof that something wasn't working. Now they feel more like information. Feedback. Something to learn from rather than something to be stopped by. That doesn't mean they're easy. It doesn't mean you don't feel frustration or doubt. But those feelings don't last the same way they used to. Because you've started to understand that progress isn't linear. It moves forward, pauses, adjusts, and sometimes even feels like it's moving backward before it continues. And instead of taking that personally, you start working with it. Chosen one, another powerful shift is how you relate to your own thoughts. You begin to notice that not every thought deserves your attention. Just because something crosses your mind doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean it's useful. Doesn't mean it needs to shape your actions. And that realization creates space. Because instead of being pulled in every direction by your thoughts, you can step back and choose which ones to engage with. That level of mental awareness changes everything. Because your thoughts influence your actions, and your actions shape your reality. So when you gain control over your attention, you gain influence over your direction. Chosen one, as this continues, your sense of identity becomes more stable. Not fixed, not rigid, but grounded. You're no longer defining yourself based on temporary situations or external validation. You're building a sense of self that comes from within, from your values, from your awareness, from your experiences. And that kind of identity doesn't shift every time something changes around you. It adapts, but it doesn't collapse. Chosen one, this is where things start to come together. Not in a perfect or complete way, but in a way that feels real. You understand yourself better. You trust yourself more. You move with more intention. And even when things are uncertain, you don't feel as lost as you once did. Because you know how to navigate uncertainty now. You've done it before. Chosen one, if you've made it this far, if you've stayed with these thoughts, if you've recognized parts of yourself in what's been said, then take a moment and be honest with yourself. You're not in the same place you were before. Not mentally, not emotionally, not in the way you see your life. And that matters more than you might realize. Because real change doesn't always come with announcements. It shows up in how you think when no one is watching, in how you respond when things don't go your way, in how you choose your next step, even when it's unclear. So instead of waiting for some external confirmation that you're on the right path, look at the evidence within yourself. Look at the awareness you've gained. Look at the patterns you've broken. Look at the control you've developed. That's real progress. And it's something no one can take from you. Now here's something to consider. If you continue in this direction, if you keep building this level of awareness, this level of intention, this level of control, where could that take you over time? Not overnight, not instantly, but steadily. Because small, consistent shifts in how you think and act create outcomes that most people never reach, simply because they never stay consistent long enough. So the question isn't whether something is happening. It already is. The question is whether you're going to stay with it, whether you're going to continue developing this version of yourself, even when it's not easy, even when it's not immediately rewarding. Because this is the part where most people stop. They get close to change, they feel the discomfort, and they go back to what's familiar. But you've already moved past that point. You've already seen what's possible when you become more aware. So don't reduce yourself back to a version you've already. Stay with the process. Stay with the clarity you're building. Stay with the direction you're creating. And if this message connected with you on any level, don't just move on from it like it was another video. Take a second and actually reflect. What has changed in you recently? What are you starting to see differently? What are you no longer willing to tolerate? Write it down, think about it, or if you want, share it. Not for validation, but for clarity. Because sometimes, putting your thoughts into words is what turns awareness into action. And if you decide to keep going from here, do it consciously. Not because of pressure, not because of expectations, but because you've reached a point where you understand that your growth is in your hands. And that's something worth continuing.